The day after Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter, launching the Civil War, the Chicago Daily Journal ran a headline that was simple and restrained. It read, "The war commenced." A young Illinois man by the name of Nathaniel Kenyon was just 23 years old at the time. A month later, in May of 1861, he joined the 11th Illinois Volunteer Infantry and became one of hundreds of thousands of Illinois men to eventually enter the conflict. The names of many of them lie buried in records, and most are long forgotten. But the Illinoisan who oversaw the divisive conflict remains a towering figure. This is how Abraham Lincoln looked 2 years before becoming president.
This wonderful watercolor was done in 1860 by Cornelia Fassett, who was a Chicago artist. Her husband, Samuel Fassett, was also a photographer, and he made a photograph of Lincoln in 1859. And she based the watercolor on the photograph.
Lincoln made many trips to Chicago, and it became his political headquarters. It was in Chicago at the famous Wigwam that Lincoln received the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1860. Among his supporters were John Jones and his wife Mary, freeborn blacks who had reached a level of prominence in Chicago.
Chicago's black community at the time was quite small, but they were very active in this abolitionist movement. And Chicago actually became known as a hotbed of abolitionism. After Lincoln died, his body was brought back to Springfield, but along the way made many stops, including Chicago. And John Jones was an honorary pallbearer for Lincoln.
By the outset of the Civil War, Chicago was an emerging metropolis with slightly more than 100,000 residents. The Chicago Board of Trade was already well established, and when President Lincoln called for more volunteers in the summer of 1862, Board of Trade members collected $15,000 to raise several Illinois units, including the Board of Trade Battery. They carried this flag into battle, and among those who signed up was one John Stagg.
This is a jacket that Private John Stagg wore. He was a member of the Chicago Board of Trade Battery. He enlisted in August of 1862 and then was killed at Stones River in Tennessee near the close of 1862.
Stagg's jacket is one of the Chicago Public Library's priceless collection of Civil War artifacts now on display at the Harold Washington Library. The collection includes one of the saddles Ulysses S. Grant used while commanding Union troops. There's also authentic 150-year-old hardtack, the almost inedible biscuits that sustained soldiers north and south. The first Union casualty of note was not only a Chicagoan, but a friend of Abraham and Mary Lincoln. Elmer Ellsworth became famous for organizing the colorful regiment known as the Zouaves.
Ellsworth was killed in May of 1861, about a month after the war began. And he was killed while trying to take down a Confederate flag that was flying in Alexandria, Virginia. Lincoln ordered his funeral to be held at the White House, being a close personal friend, and he was very distraught with his death. And the memorial wreath, according to our records, was actually made by Mary Todd Lincoln, and she placed it upon Ellsworth's casket during the funeral ceremony.
Another Chicagoan who answered the call was Colonel James Mulligan, who raised the 23rd Illinois Volunteer Infantry Regiment, better known as the Irish Brigade. Mulligan was killed in battle in July 1864. His famous dying words were reportedly, "Lay me down and save the flag," which were later inscribed on his battle sword.
I always thought it referred to the United States flag, but it really referred to the colors of the Irish Brigade. So you can still see his loyalty to his Irish roots.
No Civil War battles were fought in Illinois, but Chicago became a refuge for some fleeing the horrors of the war. In the summer of 1861, a Louisville, Kentucky merchant by the name of Elvira Badger sold his business and his home and freed his 6 slaves. He then moved to a house on Chicago's lakefront with his wife and 4 children. Elvira Badger kept a journal of her trip to Chicago. It is part of the Newberry Library's vast collection of Civil War documents. Upon reaching the city, she wrote,
"We arrived in Chicago this morning at 6. My husband was there to receive us all, and we were delighted to see him. He carried us right to our home. He has taken for us a magnificent house on Michigan Avenue. We are all delighted.
2 of the Badgers' former slaves became house servants for the family in Chicago. One of them, named Nancy, was described by Mrs. Badger as a loyal, true, and steadfast friend. Nancy was held in such high esteem by the Badger family that she was photographed with the 4 children, a rare image for the time. Chicago also contributed to the war in small ways, such as with these booklets printed for the spiritual guidance of the men at war.
Its title is The Soldier's Hymn Book, and it was published by the Chicago Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, in 1862. And so it's a little hymn book that would be used and kind of kept on a person. And the real neat thing about it is at the very back page, there is a manuscript that says October 18th, 1862, Camp Douglas, Illinois. So this was at one point down at Camp Douglas. And in 1862 is when Camp Douglas opened up to be a Confederate prison.
By the time the guns and cannons came to rest in 1865, several thousand Illinoisans had given their lives in the war. Among them, the state's most famous warrior. A century and a half later, their legacy lives on. For Chicago Tonight, I'm Eddie Arruza.